I'm Mildred Benson, 67, and I've spent 3 years being called a gold digger by my late husband's family. At Robert's funeral last month, his sister actually whispered it loud enough for the entire front row to hear. They think I'm married there. 89-year-old patriarch for his money. That I'm some opportunist who's swooped in during his final years. The whispers, the cold shoulders, the lawyers already circling knife, endured it all in silence. But when I opened that manila envelope from the National Archives yesterday, everything changed. Inside were Robert's classified Pearl Harbor service records. Documents that revealed a truth so profound it would shatter every assumption they'd made about our marriage and about the man they thought they knew. What I discovered didn't just clear my name. It revealed a love story that began 80 years ago. In the smoke and chaos of December 7th, 1941, before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow saves something extra special for you. If you've ever been judged for loving someone others didn't understand, like this video, this story will show you that the deepest connections often hide the most extraordinary truths. That funeral was the longest day of my life, and I've lived through plenty of long days. I sat in the front pew of St. Mark's Episcopal Church, clutching Robert's simple gold wedding ring in my palm while his family filled the rows behind me like a jury ready to convict. The ring was nothing special. We'd bought it at a small jewelry store downtown 3 years ago. Robert had insisted on something simple, something that wouldn't draw attention. Now I understand why his sister Margaret sat directly behind me, her voice cutting through the organ music like a blade. "Look at her," she whispered to her daughter, "sitting there like she owns the place. It's 3 years of marriage, and she thinks she's entitled to everything he worked for his whole life." I didn't turn around. I learned that dignity was my only defense against their cruelty. Robert had taught me that in the final months of his life, when the accusations grew louder and more persistent, "Let them talk, Millie," he'd say, using the nickname only he was allowed to use. The truth has a way of surfacing when it's meant to. The pastor spoke about Robert's generosity, his quiet strength, his devotion to family. He mentioned our marriage briefly, respectfully, but I could feel the temperature in the room drop when he did. To them, I was the interloper, the woman who had somehow bewitched their beloved patriarch in his final years. After the service, at the reception in the church hall, the conversation stopped whenever I approached. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, accepting condolences from strangers who at least had the decency to be kind, while Robert's own flesh and blood treated me like a disease they might catch. His nephew David, a lawyer, naturally cornered me by the coffee table. "I hope you understand, Mildred, that the family will be reviewing all of Robert's financial arrangements. We want to make sure everything was done properly." The threat was clear. They were coming for me, for whatever they thought I'd stolen from them. What they didn't know was that I'd never asked Robert for anything. I'd lived in my own small apartment until the day we married, had my own modest savings, my own life. I'd fallen in love with a man who happened to have money, not the other way around. "I understand completely," I told David, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. Robert was always very careful about his affairs, more careful than any of them could imagine. The worst part came at the cemetery. As they lowered Robert's casket into the ground, Margaret leaned over to her son and said, just loud enough for me to hear, "Well, she got what she came for. Now we'll see how long she sticks around." I wanted to tell her that what I'd gotten was 3 years of the most profound love I'd ever known. 3 years of morning coffee together, of Robert reading me passages from his history books, of quiet evenings when he'd hold my hand and tell me I was the greatest gift of his long life. But I knew they'd never believe me. In their minds, I was a predator who'd targeted a vulnerable old man. Standing there in the October rain, watching dirt fall on the coffin of the only man who'd ever truly seen me, I felt more alone than I had in decades. The family dispersed quickly after the burial, whispering among themselves, planning their next moves. I stood there long after they'd gone, my hand still clutching his ring, wondering how I'd find the strength to face whatever came. Next, that night in the house we'd shared for such a brief time, I sat in Robert's study surrounded by his books and papers. The lawyers would come for these too, eventually. They'd comb through everything, looking for evidence of manipulation, of undue influence. They'd find nothing because there was nothing to find. Robert had been as sharp as ever right up until the end, and every decision he'd made had been his own. But sitting there in his chair, I realized there was so much about my husband I still didn't know. He'd been a private man, careful with his words, gentle with his secrets. I'd respected that privacy, never pushed for more than he was willing to share. Now I wondered if I'd been too respectful, too patient. Had I missed something important? In my eagerness to let him reveal himself in his own time. The ring felt warm in my palm, a small circle of gold that represented so much more than a simple marriage. It was proof that someone had loved me enough to make me his wife, to share his name and his life, however briefly. No matter what his family believed, no matter what they tried to take from me, they couldn't take that away. I slipped the ring onto my finger where it belonged, and tried to prepare myself for the battle I knew was coming. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, my world shifted on its axis. I was having my usual breakfast toast and coffee. It's the same meal I'd eaten alone for most of my adult life until Robert came along. When I heard the mail truck rumble past my window, I'd moved back to my small apartment after the funeral, unable to bear staying in the house where we'd been so happy. The mailman, Jerry, knocked on my door instead of just leaving everything in the box. He was holding a large manila envelope, official-looking and heavy. "This one needs a signature, Mrs. Benson," he said, consulting his clipboard. "Looks important." My heart skipped when I saw the return address: National Personnel Records Center, National Archives and Records Administration. The envelope was addressed to me, but the reference line mentioned Robert's full name, Robert Harrison Caldwell. It was the first time I'd seen his name written out in full like that in months. I signed Jerry's form with shaking hands, thanked him, and closed the door. The envelope felt substantial, full of papers that rustled when I tilted it. There was something almost ceremonial about the way it was sealed, as if what was inside was too important for ordinary mail. I sat at my small kitchen table, the same table where Robert and I had shared countless meals during our courtship, and stared at the envelope. The official letterhead was intimidating, all eagles and seals and formal typography. What could the National Archives want with me? What could they possibly have that related to Robert? My hands trembled as I carefully opened the seal. Inside was a thick stack of documents, some typewritten, some handwritten, all bearing official stamps and signatures. On top was a cover letter on National Archives letterhead, dated just 4 days earlier. "Dear Mrs. Caldwell," it began, and I had to stop reading for a moment. Mrs. Caldwell. They were using Robert's name, not the name I'd known him by. The letter continued, following the recent declassification of certain World War II military records. "We are releasing documents related to the service of Robert Harrison Caldwell. Service number 3,847,291, who was reported as killed in action at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Killed in action. December 7, 1941. The words swam before my eyes. Robert had been at Pearl Harbor. He'd told me he'd served in the Pacific during the war, but he'd always been vague about the details. I'd assumed he'd been stationed somewhere safe, maybe in supply or administration. He'd never mentioned Pearl Harbor, never mentioned being reported dead. My coffee grew cold as I read on. The letter explained that these records had been classified for over 80 years due to their sensitive nature, but recent changes in declassification policies had made them available to next of kin. As Robert's widow, I was entitled to receive his complete military file. I set the letter aside and looked at the documents beneath it. The first was a military service record, formal and detailed. At the top, in bold letters, was the name Robert Harrison Caldwell, followed by dates, ranks, and service locations. But it was the next line that made my breath catch. Status: killed in action. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor Naval Base, Hawaii. But that was impossible. Robert had died in my arms just a month ago, in 2024. He'd lived a full life, had a successful career, had been married before me. How could military records from 1941 list him as killed in action? I flipped through more documents, my confusion growing with each page. There were medical records, casualty reports, and what appeared to be witness statements about the attack. Robert's name appeared on dozens of forms, always with that same haunting notation, killed in action. Then I found a photograph. It was grainy, black and white, the kind of formal military portrait they took of servicemen. But the face looking back at me was unmistakably Robert Stayod's younger. But with the same kind eyes, the same gentle smile. He was wearing a Navy uniform, looking proud and impossibly young. I sat back in my chair, trying to process what I was seeing. The man I'd married, the man I'd loved, had supposedly died more than 80 years ago. But that was clearly impossible. So what did these documents mean? Why did they exist? And why had Robert never mentioned any of this? I thought about his nightmares, the way he'd sometimes wake up shouting about water and fire. I'd assumed they were just the normal anxieties of an elderly man, maybe some kind of age-related confusion. But what if they were memories? What if they were real? The morning sun shifted across my kitchen table, illuminating the document spread. Before me, like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't begin to solve. Somewhere in these pages was a truth that Robert had kept hidden for our entire marriage. A truth that might explain why his family had never really known him, why he'd always seemed to carry some invisible weight. I picked up the cover letter again and read it more carefully. At the bottom, in smaller print, was a note. Additional materials related to this case may be available upon request. Please contact our office if you require further documentation. Hands were steadier now, my shock giving way to determination. Robert had kept this secret for reasons I couldn't yet understand. But he was gone now, and I was the only one left to uncover the truth. Whatever had happened to him in 1941, whatever had led to these documents, I needed to know. I reached for my phone and dialed the number on the letterhead. When the clerk answered, I took a deep breath and said, "This is Mildred Benson. I just received some documents about my late husband, Robert Caldwell. I think there might be some kind of mistake." But even as I said it, I knew there was no mistake. The truth was more complicated than I'd ever imagined, and I was just beginning to understand how much my husband had hidden from the world. And from me, the clerk at the National Archives was patient with my confusion, but her explanations only deepened the mystery. "Mrs. Benson," she said gently, "according to our records, Robert Harrison Caldwell was indeed reported killed in action at Pearl Harbor in 1941. However, we have a notation here that suggests he may have survived, but was never officially removed from the casualty lists." "That's impossible," I said, though even as I spoke, I was remembering things, small details that had never quite made sense. The way Robert sometimes flinched when planes flew overhead, his refusal to eat certain foods that reminded him of Navy chow, the fact that he'd never wanted to visit Hawaii, always changing the subject when I suggested it. "Ma'am, we have documentation that a Robert Harrison Caldwell legally changed his name to Robert William Benson in 1947. Would that be your husband? Robert William Benson, the name he'd lived under for over 70 years, the name I'd taken when we married, but it wasn't his real name at all." I hung up the phone and sat in stunned silence. My husband had been living under an assumed identity for most of his life. The man I'd married, the man his family thought they knew, had been someone else entirely. Robert Harrison Caldwell had died at Pearl Harbor and been reborn as Robert William Benson. But why? What had happened to make a young sailor fake his own death and start over with a new name? I spent the rest of the day going through every document in the envelope, trying to piece together the story. The military records painted a picture of a dedicated young sailor, barely 20 years old, who'd been stationed at Pearl Harbor in 1941. He'd been assigned to the USS Arizona, one of the battleships that had been hit hardest during the attack. According to the witness statements, Robert had been on deck when the bombing began. He'd helped evacuate wounded sailors and had been seen running toward the ship's magazine to help fight fires. Then there was an explosion, and several witnesses reported seeing him thrown into the water. His body was never recovered, leading to his classification as killed in action, body not recovered, but somehow he'd survived. The medical records showed that a John Doe matching his description had been pulled from the harbor hours after the attack, badly burned and unconscious. He'd been taken to a military hospital, where he'd remained in critical condition for weeks. I found what looked like hospital intake forms, handwritten notes from doctors and nurses. One entry, dated December 15th, 1941, caught my attention. Patient. Continues to exhibit signs of severe psychological trauma. Refuses to give name or service number. Keeps repeating they think I'm dead and I can't go back. The picture was becoming clearer, though it raised more questions than it answered. Robert had survived Pearl Harbor, but the trauma had been so severe that he'd chosen to remain dead rather than return to his old life. He'd somehow obtained new identity papers and started over as Robert William Benson. I thought about the man I'd known, gentle and kind, but always carrying an invisible sadness. He'd been a successful businessman, well respected in the community, but he'd never talked about his past before the late 1940s. When I'd asked about his family, he'd always said they were gone, that he was alone in the world. I'd assumed he meant they died, but now I wondered if he'd been the one who died. At least officially, there was another document near the bottom of the stack that made my breath catch. It was a letter written in Robert's distinctive handwriting, dated 1947. It was addressed to someone named Captain Morrison. It appeared to be some kind of confession or explanation. Dear Captain Morrison, it began, I know what I did was wrong, but I couldn't face going back to a life that felt like a lie. Everyone I knew thinks I'm dead, and maybe that's for the best. The man who went to Pearl Harbor that morning died. In that harbor, even if his body survived. I can't be that person anymore. I hope you can understand and forgive me for what I've done. The letter was never sent. It was still in the envelope, as if Robert had written it but couldn't bring himself to mail it. But it explained everything. The young sailor who'd survived Pearl Harbor had been so traumatized, so changed by what he'd experienced, that he'd chosen to let his old identity die and create a new one. I understood now why he'd been so secretive about his past, why he'd never talked about the war in detail. He'd been carrying the weight of this deception for over 70 years. Every time someone thanked him for his service, every Memorial Day and Veterans Day, he'd had to smile and nod while knowing that officially he'd never served at all. Then, phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. It was Robert's nephew, David, his voice sharp with suspicion. Mildred, I need to ask you something. We've been going through Uncle Robert's papers, and we found some discrepancies. Did he ever mention anything about military service? I looked at the documents spread across my table, at the photograph of my young husband in his Navy uniform, at the letter that revealed his deepest secret. Why do you ask? Because we can't find any record of him serving in World War II. We've checked with the Veterans Administration, and they have no file for Robert William Benson. It's like he didn't exist before 1947. Maybe there was a clerical error, I said, carefully. Records from that time period aren't always complete. Maybe, David said, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. Or maybe Uncle Robert wasn't who he claimed to be. After I hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness of my apartment, surrounded by the evidence of Robert's secret life. His family was starting to ask questions, and I was the only one who knew the answers. But these weren't just Robert's secrets anymore, they were mine too. And I had to decide what to do with them. The man I'd married had been living a lie for over 7 decades, but it hadn't been a malicious lie. It had been the desperate choice of a young man, so broken by war that he'd chosen to disappear rather than face the world he'd left behind. He'd built a new life, a good life, but he'd never been able to fully escape the shadow of Pearl Harbor. I thought about our wedding day, how Robert had cried when he said his vows. I'd thought it was just the emotion of the moment, but now I wondered if those tears had been for all the years he'd spent alone, carrying this secret, believing he was unworthy of love because of what he'd done. But I had loved him, lies and all. And now I had to decide whether to honor his secret or to finally tell the truth he'd been too afraid to reveal. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Robert as he must have been that morning, young, brave, and utterly unprepared for what was about to happen. I'd gotten up and made myself tea, and now I sat at my kitchen table with the documents spread out before me, trying to piece together the story of that terrible day. The witness statements were the most revealing. They painted a picture of chaos and heroism, of young men thrust into a nightmare they'd never imagined, According to Seaman First Class Tommy Rodriguez, Robert had been on deck polishing brass when the first planes appeared. At first we thought it was some kind of drill Rodriguez had written. Then we saw the rising sun symbols on the wings, and all hell broke loose. The USS Arizona Roberts ship had been moored at Battleship Row when the attack began. She was hit by armor-piercing bombs that penetrated her forward magazines, causing a massive explosion that killed over 1,000 men instantly. But Robert hadn't been among them. According to the statements, he'd been aft when the first bombs hit, helping to man the anti-aircraft guns. Gunner's mate, second class Michael O'Brien, had seen Robert in action. Caldwell was fearless, running ammunition to the gun crews even when the deck was on fire around him. He pulled at least 3 wounded men to safety before the big explosion. Last I saw him, he was heading toward the magazine, trying to help fight the fires. The big explosion. I'd read about it in history books, seen it in documentaries. The USS Arizona had been destroyed by a bomb that detonated her forward ammunition magazine, creating a blast so powerful it lifted the ship's forward turrets, right? Off the deck. The explosion had been so massive that it was felt miles away, and the ship had settled to the bottom of the harbor in minutes. But somehow Robert had survived. The medical records told that part of the story. A hospital corpsman named Janet Morrison had written detailed notes about the unconscious sailor who'd been pulled from the water hours after the attack. Patient severely burned on hands and arms. It's possible concussion. Keeps drifting in and out of consciousness. When awake, he appears disoriented and keeps asking about his shipmates. There was a casualty report that chilled me to read. Listed the names of Robert's gun crew, the men he'd been serving with that morning. Every single one of them was marked as killed in action. Robert had been the only survivor from his station. I could imagine how that must have felt, waking up in a hospital bed to learn that everyone you'd been fighting alongside was dead. The guilt would have been overwhelming. In the witness statements, several men mentioned Robert's dedication to his crew, how he'd always looked out for the younger sailors. To survive when they hadn't would have felt like a betrayal, even though it wasn't his fault. The psychological evaluation, written 2 weeks after the attack, gave me insight into his state of mind. Patient exhibits classic signs of survivor's guilt and severe combat trauma. Refuses to discuss the events of December 7th. Has expressed wish that he had died with his shipmates. Recommend extended psychiatric treatment. But the most heartbreaking document was a letter that Robert had apparently written to his parents, though it was never sent. The envelope was addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Henry Caldwell, Topeka, Kansas, but it was stamped returned to sender deceased. His parents had died while he was in the hospital, victims of a car accident just after Christmas 1941. The letter was brief but devastating. Dear Mom and Dad, I'm alive, but I don't know if I should be. All my friends are dead, and I can't understand why I was spared. Keep thinking I should have done more, should have saved more of them. I don't know how to come home and pretend everything is normal when nothing will ever be normal again. Now I understood why he'd chosen to disappear. He'd lost his entire crew, his parents, and his sense of purpose all within a month. The young man who'd gone to Pearl Harbor that morning had indeed died there, even if his body had survived. What had emerged from that hospital was someone else entirely, someone who felt he didn't deserve to live the life that Robert Harrison Caldwell was supposed to have. There was one more document that completed the picture. It was a discharge summary from the Naval Hospital, dated March 15, 1942. Patient Robert Harrison Caldwell has been removed from active duty due to severe psychological trauma. Recommend extended leave and continued psychiatric treatment. Patient has expressed desire to return to civilian life permanently. But there was a handwritten note at the bottom. Added in different ink, patient disappeared from hospital grounds. March 16, 1942. Whereabouts unknown. Recommend updating casualty lists to reflect Mia's status. He'd simply walked away. A young man so broken by war and loss that he'd chosen to vanish rather than face the world he'd left behind. And somehow he'd managed to create a new identity, a new life as Robert William Benson. I thought about the man I'd married, the quiet dignity with which he'd carried himself, the way he'd always seemed to be holding something back. Now I knew what he'd been holding back, not just the secret of his identity, but the weight of all those deaths, all those friends who'd never made it home. The nightmares made sense now. The way he'd sometimes wake up calling out names I'd never heard before. Tommy, Mike, Johnny. They hadn't been random sounds from a confused mind. They'd been the names of his shipmates, his friends, the men who'd died while he lived. I found myself crying as I read. Not just for Robert, but for all of them, for the young sailors who died that day, for the families who'd lost sons and husbands and fathers, for the man who'd survived but felt too guilty to live. It was a tragedy that had rippled through decades, affecting not just the dead but the living who'd been left behind. But there was something else in these documents, something that made me sit up straighter. In the medical records, I found references to the nurses who'd cared for Robert during his recovery. There was a particular notation that caught my attention. Patient has responded well to Nurse M. Benson, who has shown exceptional compassion. In caring for trauma cases, Nurse M. Benson. The name was familiar, but it took me a moment to place it. Then I remembered my maiden name had been Benson. And in 1941, I'd been a young nurse working in military hospitals, caring for wounded servicemen. My hands began to shake as the implications hit me. Could it be possible? Could Robert have known me all those years ago when we were both young and the world was at war? The coincidence seemed too incredible to believe, but as I stared at that notation, I began to wonder if our meeting later in life hadn't been chance at all. I needed to know more. I needed to understand not just what had happened to Robert that day, but what had happened to me the next morning. I drove to the Riverside National Cemetery, where Robert had volunteered every Memorial Day for the past 15 years. I'd always thought his dedication was admirable, but I'd never understood the intensity with which he approached those ceremonies. Now I wondered if there was more to it than simple patriotism. I found the groundskeeper, an elderly man named Frank, who'd known Robert well. "Mrs. Benson," he said, tipping his hat. "I was sorry to hear about Robert. He was one of our most dedicated volunteers. Frank, I need to ask you something. Robert spent a lot of time here, didn't he? More than just the ceremonies?" Frank nodded. "Oh yes, he came here often, usually alone, early in the morning. He had a particular spot he liked to visit over by the World War II Memorial. There's a plaque there with names from Pearl Harbor. He'd stand there for the longest time, just reading the names. My heart began to race. "Could you show me?" Frank led me across the cemetery to a granite memorial wall, black stone polished to a mirror finish. Engraved on its surface were hundreds of names, sailors, soldiers, and civilians who died at Pearl Harbor. I scanned the columns of names until I found what I was looking for. Robert Harrison Caldwell, Seaman First Class, USS Arizona. There it was, carved in stone. Robert's real name listed among the dead. For over 80 years, people had come to this memorial to honor his memory, never knowing that the man they were memorializing was still alive, still carrying the weight of that day. He'd bring flowers sometimes, Frank continued. Not expensive ones, just simple white roses, a teed. Place them right here, by the base of the memorial. Never said much, but I could tell it meant something special to him. I traced Robert's name with my finger, feeling the depth of the engraving. How many times had he stood here, reading his own name among the dead? How had it felt to mourn his former self, to grieve for the life he'd given up? Frank, did he ever talk about the war, about Pearl Harbor? The old man shook his head. Not directly, but once I found him here on December 7th, that was the anniversary. You know, he was crying, just standing here with tears streaming down his face. I asked if he was all right, and he said something strange. He said they were good boys, Frank. They deserved better than what they got. I spent an hour at that memorial, reading every name, trying to imagine Robert as a young man standing among these sailors. Found the names from his gun, crew to me. Rodriguez, Michael O'Brien, Johnny Murphy, all the men mentioned in the witness statements. They'd been barely out of their teens when they died, full of hopes and dreams that were cut short in a matter of minutes. On my way home, stopped at the local library and asked to use their genealogy database. I needed to understand more about Robert's original family, the people he'd left behind when he chose to disappear. What I found broke my heart all over again. Robert Harrison Caldwell had been the only child of Henry and Martha Caldwell of Topeka, Kansas. His father had been a schoolteacher, his mother a seamstress. They'd been proud of their son's service in the Navy, had sent him letters every week that were returned after the attack marked deceased. They died in that car accident in December 1941, never knowing their son had survived. But there was more. The Caldwells had established a small scholarship fund in Robert's memory, meant to help other young men from Kansas join the Navy. The fund was still active, managed by a bank in Topeka. For over 80 years, young sailors had been receiving education assistance in honor of a man who was actually still alive. I thought about the cruel irony of it all. Robert had spent his entire adult life carrying the guilt of his survival, believing he was unworthy of the life he'd been given. But his parents, in their grief, had created something beautiful in his memory, way for other young people to serve their country with honor. There was something else that struck me as I read through the family records. The Caldwells had been devout Christians, people who believed deeply in forgiveness and redemption. If they had known their son was alive, if they'd understood what he'd been through, they would have welcomed him home with open arms. They would have helped him heal, would have told him that survival wasn't something to be ashamed of. But Robert hadn't known that. In his traumatized state, he'd assumed that his survival was somehow a betrayal of his fallen comrades. He'd punished himself for living by giving up everything that had made him who he was, his name, his family, his history. I drove back to my apartment with a new understanding of the man I'd married. Robert William Benson had been a good man, kind and generous and loving. But he'd also been a man haunted by ghosts, living a life he felt he didn't deserve. Every kindness he'd shown, every gesture of love, had been his way of trying to earn the right to exist. That evening, I sat in my living room with a photo album from our brief marriage. There was a picture of Robert at the cemetery's Memorial Day ceremony, standing at attention during the playing of taps. I'd always thought he looked sad in that photo, but now I understood why. He wasn't just honoring the fallen, he was mourning his own lost youth, his own buried identity. There was another photo that took on new meaning: Robert and me at a Veterans Day dinner, surrounded by other aging servicemen. He'd been quiet. That night, almost withdrawn. When someone had asked him about his service, he'd given vague answers and changed the subject. I'd thought he was just being modest. But now I knew he'd been protecting the secret that had defined his entire adult life. The weight of what I'd discovered was overwhelming. Robert had lived for over 7 decades with a lie that had been born from trauma and guilt. He'd denied himself the honor and recognition that should have been his, had never been able to properly grieve for his fallen friends or celebrate his own survival. But there was something else, something that gave me hope. In choosing to marry me and allowing himself those 3 years of happiness, Robert had finally begun to believe he deserved love. He'd still kept his secrets, but he'd opened his heart to the possibility of peace. I looked again at the notation about Nurse M. Benson and felt a shiver of anticipation. If my suspicions were correct, if Robert and I had known each other during the war, then our reunion hadn't been chance at all. It had been destiny. 2 people who'd been marked by the same tragedy finding each other again after 8 decades. Tomorrow, I would begin searching through my own past, looking for the memories I'd buried just as deeply as Robert had buried his identity. The truth was bigger than either of us had imagined, and I was determined to uncover all of it. I hadn't opened my old hope chest in years, sat in the back of my bedroom closet, buried under winter coats and forgotten memories. But that morning, driven by a need to understand the connection between my past and Robert's, I dragged it out and set it on my bed. The chest had belonged to my mother, and I'd filled it with mementos from my youth, photographs, letters, certificates, and other keepsakes I'd thought important at the time. Most of it seems silly now. It's the treasures of a young woman who'd believed the future held nothing but promise. But there, at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, was my hospital volunteer badge from 1941. I held it, up to the light, reading the faded text. Mildred Benson, volunteer nurse, Naval Hospital, Pearl Harbor. The memories came flooding back, vivid and painful after all these years. I'd been 22 years old, fresh out of nursing school, when the call went out for volunteers to help with the casualties from Pearl Harbor. I'd been working at a small hospital in San Francisco, but when I heard about the attack, I'd known I had to help. The journey to Hawaii had been surreal, a civilian transport plane filled with medical personnel, all of us trying to prepare for something we couldn't possibly imagine. When we'd landed in Honolulu on December 10th, the harbor was still burning. The smell of smoke and oil hung in the air like a shroud. The Naval Hospital had been overwhelmed. Hundreds of wounded sailors had been brought in, some with burns covering most of their bodies, others with injuries so severe that our only job was to make them comfortable in their final hours. I'd been assigned to the trauma ward, where the most critical cases were housed. I found my old journal from that time, pages brittle with age, but the writing still legible. Reading my own words from 83 years ago was like stepping back in time. December 12, 1941. The burns are the worst part. These boys, and they are just boys. Most of them have been through hell. Some of them don't even know yet how badly they're hurt. They keep asking when they can return to their ships, not understanding that their ships are gone, sunk to the bottom of the harbor. I remembered the faces, the voices, the desperate attempts to save young men who'd been broken by war. But as I read through my journal entries, one patient began to stand out from the others. I'd written about him several times, always with a mixture of professional concern and personal affection. December 15, 1941. The John Doe in bed 7 is awake more often now, but he still won't tell us his name. Dr. Morrison thinks it's psychological. Trauma that he's blocking out memories too painful to bear. He has the kindest eyes I've ever seen, even filled with so much pain. When I change his bandages, he always says thank you, even though I know it hurts terribly. December 18, 1941. John Doe asked me my name today. When I told him, he smiled for the first time since he arrived. He said Mildred was his grandmother's name, that it meant gentle strength. I've never thought of my name that way, but coming from him, it sounded beautiful. December 22, 1941. I found John Doe crying today. He'd remembered something about his shipmates, about trying to save them. He keeps saying he should have done more, that he failed them. I told him that surviving wasn't failing, that sometimes living takes more courage than dying. I don't think he believed me. My hands were shaking as I read my own words from so long ago. Could this John Doe have been Robert? The timeline was right, and the descriptions matched what I'd learned from his medical records. But it seemed impossible that I wouldn't have remembered him, that such an encounter wouldn't have stayed with me. But then I found an entry that made everything clear. December 28, 1941, John is being transferred to a psychiatric facility on the mainland tomorrow. Dr. Morrison says he needs specialized treatment for his trauma. I wanted to say goodbye, but when I went to his room this morning, he was gone. A nurse said he'd walked out sometime during the night. I hope he finds peace wherever he goes. I'll never forget those kind eyes. I set the journal down and closed my eyes, trying to summon more memories of that time. It had been such a chaotic period, with new patients arriving daily and others being transferred or dying. I'd cared for hundreds of wounded men during my 6-month assignment, and while I've remembered many of them over the years, the details had blurred together. But now, knowing what I knew about Robert, I could see the connections. The young sailor who disappeared from the hospital had been traumatized, guilt-ridden, and desperate to escape his old identity. He'd been kind and grateful even in his pain. The description fit the man I'd later married perfectly. There was something else in my hope chest that I'd forgotten about, a small metal object wrapped in a scrap of cloth. When I unwrapped it, I found a hospital bracelet, the kind they used to identify patients who couldn't identify themselves. The name section was blank, but there was a number, 1207 to 47. I stared at the bracelet, trying to remember why I'd kept it. Then it came back to me. John Doe had been wearing it when he disappeared. I'd found it on his bedside table the next morning and had impulsively pocketed it, thinking I might be able to return it to him someday. Instead, I'd kept it for 83 years. a memento of a patient who'd touched my heart. The implications were staggering. If Robert had been my John Doe, then our love story hadn't begun 3 years ago when we'd met at the library. It had begun in a hospital room in 1941, when a young nurse had cared for a traumatized sailor and he'd found comfort in her gentle strength. But why hadn't he told me? Why had he let me believe our meeting was a coincidence when he must have recognized me the moment we met? The answer, I realized, was probably the same reason he'd kept his identity secret for so long. He'd been protecting me from the pain of knowing, just as he'd been protecting himself from the guilt of surviving. I thought about our courtship, the careful way Robert had approached our relationship. He'd been so gentle, so patient, as if he'd been afraid I might disappear if he moved too quickly. I'd attributed it to the natural caution of an older man who'd been hurt before, but now I wondered if it had been something else entirely. He'd been giving me the choice to love him without knowing our history, without the weight of obligation or pity that might have colored my feelings. He'd wanted to be loved for who he was in the present, not for who he'd been in the past or what we'd shared in our youth. The cruelty of it all overwhelmed me. We'd found each other twice in one lifetime, first as young people thrown together by war, then as elderly souls seeking companionship in our golden years. Both times, the connection had been real and deep. But Robert had carried the burden of that knowledge alone, had loved me while knowing I didn't remember him. I picked up the hospital bracelet again, running my fingers over the numbers. This small piece of metal was proof of a connection that went back 8 decades, evidence of a love story that was far more profound than either of us had understood. Tomorrow, I would start making calls, trying to track down more records from that time. I needed to understand the full scope of what Robert had known and when he'd known it. But tonight, I sat with my memories and my grief, mourning not just for the husband I'd lost, but for all the years we'd missed because he'd been too afraid. To tell me the truth, it was October 15th, 1995, and I remember the date exactly because it was the day my life changed forever again. I'd been a widow for 3 years, my first husband having passed from cancer in 1992 at 62. I'd resigned myself to living alone, filling my days with volunteer work and my evenings with books. I developed a particular interest in world war to history, partly because of my own experiences during the war, but mostly because I was trying to make sense of memories that had grown more vivid with age. The young faces of those wounded sailors haunted me more now than they had in decades, and I found myself drawn to books and documentaries that might help me understand what they'd endured. The Riverside Public Library had an excellent history section, and I'd become a regular fixture there, claiming the same corner table every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. I was deep in a book about the Pacific Theater when I noticed him, an elderly gentleman with silver hair and the most familiar kind eyes I'd ever seen. He was sitting 2 tables away, surrounded by books about Pearl Harbor. Every few minutes, he'd stop reading and stare out the window, his expression distant and troubled. There was something about his posture, the careful way he held himself, that reminded me of the wounded soldiers I'd cared for during the war. After several weeks of these parallel research sessions, he approached my table. "Excuse me," he said, his voice soft and carefully modulated. "I couldn't help but notice you're reading about the war. I hope you don't mind my asking, but did you serve?" "I was a nurse," I replied. "I volunteered at a naval hospital after Pearl Harbor. What about you?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment, he looked almost panicked, as if I'd asked him to reveal state secrets. Then he composed himself and said, "I was in the Pacific. Nothing heroic, just did my job." He introduced himself as Robert Benson, and I told him my name was Mildred. When he heard it, he smiled in a way that seemed both sad and wonderful. "Mildred," he repeated, "that's a beautiful name. It suits you." We began talking about the books we were reading, sharing insights about the war and its aftermath. Robert was clearly well educated about the subject, but there was something personal in the way he discussed it, as if he wasn't just studying history but trying to understand his own experience. Sometimes I think we spend too much time looking backward. I said during one of our conversations, "The war was a long time ago, but it shaped everything that came after," Robert replied. "For some people, it never really ended. Over the following months, our library meetings became the highlight of my week. Robert was intelligent and thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor that emerged once he felt comfortable. But there was always something guarded about him, as if he was constantly monitoring himself to avoid revealing too much. He never talked about his family or his past before the war. When I asked about his service, he'd give vague answers and change the subject. I assumed he'd seen combat and didn't like to talk about it. Many veterans were the same way. What struck me most about Robert was his kindness. He remembered details about my life that I'd mentioned weeks earlier, always asked about my volunteer work, and listened with genuine interest when I talked about my late husband or my concerns about aging alone. But he rarely shared similar details about himself. "Don't you have family?" I asked one afternoon after he'd mentioned spending holidays alone. "I did once," he said quietly, "but that was a long time ago. People move on, start new lives. Sometimes it's better to let the past stay in the past." I sensed pain behind his words, but didn't push. We were both old enough to understand that. Everyone carried their own burdens, their own secrets. Our friendship deepened slowly, carefully. Robert would walk me to my car after our library sessions, always making sure I got there safely. Once, when I mentioned I was having trouble with a leaky faucet, he showed up at my apartment the next day with a toolbox. "Hope you don't mind," he said. I was in the neighborhood and thought I could help. He wasn't in the neighborhood I'd checked. He'd driven 20 minutes out of his way to fix a problem I'd mentioned in passing. It was such a thoughtful gesture that I invited him to stay for dinner. That evening, sitting across from each other at my small dining table, felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the comfortable intimacy of shared solitude. Robert helped with the dishes, and we talked about books and music and the changing world around us. When it was time for him to leave, neither of us seemed to want the evening to end. "Mildred," he said as he stood at my door, "would you like to have dinner again sometime? Maybe at a restaurant?" I looked into those kind eyes and felt my heart flutter like a schoolgirl's. "I'd like that very much." Our first official date was at a quiet Italian restaurant downtown. Robert was nervous. I could tell, constantly checking to make sure I was comfortable, that my meal was satisfactory, that I was enjoying myself. It was endearing, this anxiety from a man who otherwise carried himself with such dignity. "You don't have to take care of me, you know," I said gently. "I'm tougher than I look." "I know you are," he replied. "I could tell that the first time I saw you. You have a strength about you, a gentle strength that—" He stopped abruptly, as if he'd said too much. What? That reminded me of someone I knew a long time ago," he finished quietly. Looking back now, I realized there were signs even then. The way he sometimes looked at me as if he was seeing a ghost. The careful attention he paid to my reactions when I talked about my nursing days. The fact that he seemed to know things about me that I didn't remember telling him. But at the time, I was simply grateful to have found companionship in my later years. Robert made me feel seen and valued in a way I hadn't experienced since my first husband's illness. He brought me flowers, not because it was expected, but because he'd noticed I loved the smell of roses. He remembered that I preferred tea to coffee and always made sure there was honey available. When we had dinner together, the progression from friendship to romance was as natural as breathing. One evening, after we'd been dating for several months, Robert took my hand across the dinner table and said, "Mildred, I need you to know that these past months have been the happiest of my entire life." "Mine too," I replied, and meant it. "I'm not a young man," he continued. "I come with a lot of history, some of it complicated. If you'd rather keep things as they are—" I squeezed his hand. "Robert, we're both too old for complicated. Whatever your history is, it made you the man you are today. And that's the man I'm falling in love with." The words surprised me as I said them, but they were true. I was falling in love at 63, something I'd never thought possible. Robert's eyes filled with tears. "I love you too, Mildred, more than you could possibly know." If only I had known then what I know now, that his love was built on a foundation of shared history stretching back more than half a century. That when he looked at me, he wasn't just seeing the woman I'd become, but remembering the young nurse who'd shown him kindness in his darkest hour. But perhaps that would have changed everything, and not necessarily for the better. Our love story was meant to unfold the way it did, with patience and tenderness and the wisdom that comes with age. The truth would come later. When we were both strong enough to bear its weight, our courtship unfolded with the deliberate pace of people who understood that time, while precious, shouldn't be rushed. Robert was a gentleman in the truest sense, opening doors, offering his arm when we walked, always asking if I needed anything before attending to his own needs. But there was something almost reverent in the way he treated me, as if I were made of delicate porcelain that might shatter if handled roughly. It was during one of our evening walks through Riverside Park that I first noticed the nightmares. We'd been dating for about 6 months, and Robert had taken to calling me every evening before bed. That particular night, he sounded exhausted. "Are you feeling all right?" I asked. "Just tired," he said, but there was something strained in his voice. "I haven't been sleeping well lately. Bad dreams." There was a long pause. "Something like that. Sometimes the past has a way of catching up with you, even when you think you've left it behind." I wanted to ask more, but Robert had a way of closing conversations when they ventured too close to his personal history. "Instead," I said, "would you like some company? I could come over and make you some tea." "That's kind of you, Mildred, but I'll be fine. These spells pass eventually." Tea, but they didn't pass. Over the following weeks, Robert grew increasingly tired and distant. Sometimes he'd call off our dates at the last minute, apologizing profusely, but offering no real explanation. When we did see each other, he seemed to be fighting some internal battle, the tension drifting even in the middle of conversations. One evening, when I couldn't stand it anymore, I drove to his apartment unannounced. When he answered the door, he looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept in days. "Mildred, what are you doing here?" "I'm worried about you, Robert. You're not yourself lately." He stood in the doorway for a moment, clearly debating whether to let me in. Finally, he stepped aside. "I'm sorry, I don't mean to be rude. It's just these are difficult times for me." His apartment was tidy but sparse, decorated with the minimal touches of a man who'd lived alone for decades. What struck me most was what wasn't there: no family photographs, no personal mementos, no evidence of a life lived before our meeting. It was as if Robert had materialized, fully formed, at age 71. But on his desk, I noticed something that made me pause: a purple heart in a simple frame, placed where he could see it but partially hidden behind a lamp. When I moved closer to look at it, Robert quickly stepped in front of me. "That's not mine," he said quickly. "It belonged to a friend." "Robert, you don't have to hide your service from me. I've told you. I was a nurse during the war. I understand what you went through." "No," he said, his voice sharp with an emotion I couldn't identify. "You don't understand. Nobody understands." The outburst surprised both of us. Robert immediately looked stricken, as if he'd revealed more than he'd intended. "I'm sorry," he said, sinking into his chair. "I didn't mean to snap at you. It's just that some things are better left buried." I knelt beside his chair and took his hands in mine. They were shaking slightly, and I could feel the tension in his whole body. "Robert, whatever happened to you during the war, whatever you saw or did, it doesn't change how I feel about you. You're a good man, a kind man. Nothing in your past could change that." He looked at me with those kind eyes I'd grown to love, and for a moment I thought he might tell me everything. But then he shook his head and pulled away. "Some sins can't be forgiven, Mildred. Some choices follow you for the rest of your life." "What choice? What sin, Robert? You're scaring me." But he wouldn't say more. Instead, he asked me to leave, promising he'd call me in a few days when he was feeling better. I left reluctantly, more confused and worried than ever. True to his word, Robert called 3 days later, sounding more like himself. He apologized for his behavior and asked if I'd have dinner with him that weekend. When I saw him again, it was as if the episode had never happened. He was charming and attentive, asking about my week and listening with genuine interest too. My answers. But I'd learned something important during those difficult few days. Robert was carrying a burden that went far deeper than typical wartime trauma. Whatever had happened to him, he believed it made him unworthy of love, unworthy of happiness. The way he treated me with such careful reverence wasn't just old-fashioned courtesy, it was the behavior of a man who believed he didn't deserve the gift he'd been given. I began to notice other things too. The way he flinched when planes flew overhead. His refusal to eat anything that reminded him of Navy food. The fact that he always paid in cash, never used credit cards that might leave a paper trail. Most telling of all was his reaction whenever I mentioned Pearl Harbor. I was thinking we could visit Hawaii sometime, I said one afternoon. I've always wanted to see the islands. Robert's face went pale. I don't think that's a good idea. Why not? The weather's beautiful year-round, and there's so much history to see. Some history is better left undisturbed, he said quietly. There are places that hold too much pain. You were stationed there, weren't you? During the war? The question hung in the air between us. Robert stared out the window for a long moment before answering. I was near there, yes, but that was a lifetime ago. A different person's life. It was the closest he'd ever come to admitting his connection to Pearl Harbor, and it confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. Robert had been there during the attack, had experienced something so traumatic that he still couldn't bear to talk about it over 50 years later. But there was something else. Something in the way he looked at me sometimes when he thought I wasn't paying attention. It was a look of recognition, of familiarity, as if he was seeing someone he'd known long before our meeting at the library. Combined with his reaction to my name that first day, it made me wonder if our connection went deeper than either of us acknowledged. Robert, I said one evening as we sat together on my couch, do you ever feel like we've met before? Like we knew each other in another life? What? He turned to look at me, and I saw something flash across his face. Surprise. What? Fear? And something that might have been longing. Why do you ask? I don't know. Sometimes when you look at me, it's as if you're seeing someone else. Someone you remember. Memory can play tricks on us as we get older, he said carefully. Sometimes we think we recognize people when we're really just recognizing something universal kindness, perhaps, or a familiar way of moving through the world. It was a thoughtful answer, but it didn't address the intensity of those moments when I caught him studying my face, as if he was trying to memorize every detail. There was something specific in his gaze, something personal and profound that went beyond simple affection. But I didn't push. Robert would tell me his secrets when he was ready, if he was ever ready. In the meantime, I would love him as he was, a man haunted by his past, but capable of extraordinary tenderness in the present. Whatever he'd done or failed to do during the war, he was spending his later years trying to make amends through small acts of kindness and devotion. And if he'd known me before, if our love story had deeper roots than either of us acknowledged, that would explain the sense of completion I felt when I was with him. It would explain why a love that had begun so late in life felt like coming home. Robert proposed on a Tuesday evening in March 1998, exactly 2.5 years after we'd met. We were having dinner at the same Italian restaurant where we'd had our first date, and I could tell he was nervous. He'd barely touched his food and kept fidgeting with his napkin. Mildred, he said finally, his voice formal and careful, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever your answer is, I'll understand. I set down my fork and gave him my full attention. In the candlelight, his face looked both hopeful and terrified. I'm 85 years old, he continued. I don't have unlimited time left, and I don't want to waste a single day of whatever time I do have. I love you more than I've ever loved anyone in my life, and I want to spend whatever years remain to me making you happy. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Will you marry me? The ring was simple. An elegant solitaire diamond set in white gold, nothing flashy or ostentatious. It was perfect, exactly what I would have chosen for myself. Oh, Robert, I breathed, feeling tears well up in my eyes. I know it's presumptuous, he said quickly, misreading my emotion. We're both set in our ways, and marriage at our age might seem— Yes, I interrupted. Yes, of course I'll marry you. The relief on his face was beautiful to see. He slipped the ring onto my finger with shaking hands, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made just for me. I want you to know, he said, that I'll take care of you for as long as I'm able. You'll never want for anything. I don't need you to take care of me financially, Robert. I have my own savings, my own life. I just need you to love me. That's the easiest promise I've ever made, he replied, lifting my hand to kiss the ring he'd just placed there. We decided on a small ceremony. It's just the two of us and 2 witnesses from the courthouse. Neither of us had much family, at least. I thought we didn't. Robert had mentioned distant relatives, but had never seemed interested in involving them in his life. I had a few cousins scattered across the country, but we'd lost touch years ago. But when Robert called his nephew David to share the news, the reaction was explosive. "You're what?" David's voice was loud enough that I could hear it from across the room. "Uncle Robert, you can't be serious. Do you barely know this woman?" "I know her well enough," Robert said calmly. "We've been together for over 2 years. 2 years isn't long enough to know someone well enough to marry them, especially at your age. Have you thought about the legal implications? The financial aspects?" Robert's jaw tightened. "David, I'm not a child, okay? I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions about my personal life. But Uncle Robert, what do you really know about her background? Her motives? A woman her age suddenly interested in a wealthy widower. That's enough." Okay. Robert's voice carried a steel-eyed rarely heard before. "Mildred is a good woman, and I won't have you questioning her character." The conversation ended badly, with David promising to look into the situation and Robert hanging up in anger. It was my first glimpse into the family dynamics that would soon make our lives miserable. Word of our engagement spread quickly through Robert's extended family. The reactions ranged from skeptical to openly hostile. His sister Margaret was the worst, calling within hours of hearing the news. "Robert, have you lost your mind?" she demanded. "You're going to marry some woman none of us have ever met. At your age. I don't need your approval, Margaret," Robert replied, but I could see the pain her words caused him. "Well, you're certainly going to need something when she takes you for everything you're worth." "Really, Robert, how naive can you be?" The simple marriage certificate we'd planned became a source of bitter controversy. David, who was a lawyer, insisted on drawing up a prenuptial agreement. Margaret demanded a full background check on me. Other relatives I'd never heard of suddenly emerged with opinions about Robert's mental state and my obvious gold-digging intentions. Robert tried to shield me from the worst of it, but it was impossible to ignore the hostility. When we went to dinner at a restaurant his family frequented, conversations would stop when we walked in. I could feel the weight of their stares, their whispered speculations about my motives. "Maybe we should wait," I suggested one evening after a particularly brutal phone call from his nephew. "Let them get used to the idea gradually." "No," Robert said firmly. "I've waited too long for happiness already. I won't let their small-mindedness rob us of whatever time we have left." We were married on April 14th, 1998, in a simple ceremony at the courthouse. Our only witnesses were the courthouse clerk and an elderly gentleman who'd been waiting to file papers and graciously agreed to help us out. I wore a pale blue dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, and Robert wore his best suit with a white rose BOUTONNIERE. It wasn't the wedding of a young girl's dreams, but it was perfect for you, quiet, dignified, and focused on the promises we were making to each other rather than the spectacle. When the judge pronounced us husband and wife and Robert kissed me, I felt as if my life was finally beginning, even at 65. But the family's hostility only intensified after the marriage. They began to question every decision Robert made, every gift he gave me, every change to his routine. When he bought me a new car after mine broke down, David accused me of manipulating him into unnecessary expenditures. When Robert updated his will to include me, Margaret threatened to contest it on grounds of undue influence. The worst part was watching what their accusations did to Robert. He became defensive and withdrawn, second-guessing himself in ways that broke my heart. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read out doubt. Exactly. But something like sadness, as if he was seeing our happiness through the lens of their suspicions. "Do you regret marrying me?" I asked him one night after Margaret had made a particularly cruel comment about my obvious fortune hunting. "Never," he said immediately. "Marrying you was the best decision I've ever made. But I regret that my family's behavior is causing you pain. They think I'm after your money." I know what they think, and they're wrong. You've never asked me for anything, never even let me pay for dinner without an argument. That was true. I'd insisted on maintaining my financial independence, paying my own bills and contributing equally to our household expenses. But to his family, my very existence was proof of mercenary intentions. The isolation was the hardest part. Robert had always been somewhat estranged from his relatives, but our marriage had severed what few connections remained. Holidays became tense affairs where we were either excluded entirely or attended under a cloud of barely concealed hostility. Social gatherings with people Robert had known for years became uncomfortable when his family members poisoned the atmosphere with their insinuations, but there were also moments of pure joy that made all the difficulty worthwhile. Quiet mornings when we read the newspaper together over coffee. Evenings when Robert would read to me from his history books, his voice gentle and scholarly. Nights when we'd talk for hours about everything and nothing. To people who'd found each other late in life but weren't wasting a moment of the time they'd been given. Robert was endlessly thoughtful, bringing me flowers for no reason, remembering things I'd mentioned in passing, making sure I felt cherished every single day. But there was always that undertone of reverence in his treatment of me, as if he felt unworthy of the happiness we'd found together. "You're too good to me," he'd say sometimes when I'd do something simple like make his favorite dinner or remember an important date. "That's what marriage is supposed to be," I'd reply, to people being good to each other. But I could see in his eyes that he didn't quite believe he deserved it. Whatever ghosts from his past were haunting him, they'd convinced him that happiness was something he had to earn rather than something he had a right to claim. Looking back now, I realize that those 3 years of marriage were Robert's attempt to finally live the life he denied himself for over 5 decades. In marrying me, he was choosing love over fear, present joy over past guilt. But the family's accusations must have felt like confirmation of what he'd always believed about himself, that he was somehow unworthy of the good things life had to offer. Still, we were happy. Despite the external pressures and his internal struggles, we created a small world where love mattered more than suspicion, where two elderly people could find comfort and companionship in each other's arms. It wasn't the dramatic romance of youth, but it was something deeper, the quiet contentment of two souls who had finally found their home. Robert's decline began subtly in the summer of 2021. At first, it was just increased fatigue, a slight shortness of breath that we attributed to the heat. He was 88 after all, and we both accepted that age would eventually take its toll. But by September, it was clear that something more serious was happening. The diagnosis came after weeks of tests that Robert endured with characteristic stoicism. Congestive heart failure, the doctor explained, likely the result of damage from decades earlier that had finally caught up with him. When I asked what could have caused such damage, the cardiologist mentioned that severe trauma, particularly involving smoke inhalation or near drowning, could sometimes create long-term cardiac issues that didn't manifest until much later in life. Robert's hand tightened on mine when the doctor said that, and I saw something flicker across his face, recognition perhaps, or fear. But he didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. By then, I'd learned to respect the boundaries he'd drawn around his past. The family's reaction to his illness was predictably awful. Instead of rallying around him, they seemed to see his declining health as an opportunity to remove me from the picture. Margaret began calling daily, ostensibly to check on Robert, but really to plant seeds of doubt about my caregiving abilities. "Are you sure Mildred is up to taking care of you?" she'd ask during her visits. "Someone your age needs professional medical care, not just a wife playing nurse." "Mildred is an excellent nurse," Robert would reply firmly. "She's taken better care of me than any professional could." But I could see the toll their constant undermining was taking on him. He began to worry obsessively about being a burden, about whether I was sacrificing too much for his care. No amount of reassurance seemed to convince him that caring for him was exactly where I wanted to be. The worst part was how alert and sharp his mind remained even as his body failed. He was fully aware of his situation, fully cognizant of the family's increasing pressure for him to make arrangements that didn't include me. The stress of it all seemed to accelerate his physical decline. One afternoon in late October, found him sitting at his desk, writing in a leather journal I'd never seen before. When I asked what he was working on, he quickly closed the book and slipped it into a drawer. "Just some thoughts," he said. "Things I want to remember. Would you like to share them with me?" He looked at me with those kind eyes that had grown increasingly sad over the past months. Maybe someday, Millie, when the time is right. It was around this time that he began having more frequent nightmares. I'd wake to find him sitting up in bed, calling out names I didn't recognize. Mike, Johnny. When I'd comfort him, he'd apologize profusely, as if his unconscious memories were somehow an imposition on me. Who were Tommy and Mike? I asked gently one morning after a particularly difficult night. Friends, he said simply. Friends I lost. A long time ago, in the war. Yes, good boys who deserved better than what they got. It was the most he'd ever said about his wartime experiences, and I treasured those few words. But I could see that even that small revelation had cost him something. As November arrived and his condition worsened, Robert became increasingly focused on making sure I would be taken care of after he was gone. He spent hours on the phone with his lawyers, updating documents and ensuring that his wishes were legally airtight. The family's hostility had made him paranoid about protecting me from their inevitable challenges to his estate. "Promise me something, Millie," he said one evening as we sat together in his study. "Promise me that when I'm gone, you won't let them convince you that what we had wasn't real." "Robert, don't talk like that. You're going to be fine." "No, I'm not, and we both know it. But promise me anyway. Whatever they say about me, about us, remember that I loved you more than life itself." "I promise," I said, though I couldn't understand why he seemed so worried about my faith in our relationship. The sealed envelope appeared on his bedside table 3 days before he died. I noticed it when I brought him his morning medication. A cream-colored envelope with my name written in Robert's careful handwriting. "What's this?" I asked. "Something for later," he said. "After I'm gone, promise me you won't open it until then." "Robert, promise me, Millie, it's important." I promised, though the envelope seemed to radiate significance that made me uncomfortable. What could be so important that it had to wait until after his death? What secret was he still keeping that was too difficult to share while he was alive? His final words to me came on a Tuesday morning as I was adjusting his pillows. He'd been drifting in and out of consciousness for 2 days, and I thought he was asleep when suddenly his eyes opened and focused on my face with startling clarity. "Mildred?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm here, sweetheart." "You saved me twice," he said, his words deliberate and careful. "Both times, you saved me." Before I could ask what he meant, his eyes closed again, and he slipped back into unconsciousness. He died that afternoon, holding my hand with the autumn sun streaming through the bedroom window and the sounds of children playing in the street below. The funeral arrangements became another battleground with his family. They questioned every decision I made, from the choice of flowers to the selection of readings. Margaret actually suggested that perhaps I shouldn't sit in the front row, since the family should be given priority. "Mildred is his wife," David reminded his aunt, though even he seemed uncomfortable with the situation. "She has the right to sit wherever she wants." But having the right and feeling welcome were two different things. At the service, I sat alone in that front pew while his blood relatives filled the rows behind me, their whispered conversations creating a constant undercurrent of disapproval. The pastor spoke beautifully about Robert's generosity and quiet strength, but I could tell that even he was struggling with the family dynamics. When he mentioned our marriage, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees at the graveside. As they lowered Robert's casket into the ground, Margaret made her cruel comment about me getting what I'd come for. But what struck me most was how wrong she was. What I'd gotten wasn't money or security. It was 3 years of the most profound love I'd ever known. 3 years of morning coffee and evening conversations, gentle touches and shared silences, of feeling cherished and valued in a way I'd never experienced before. That night, alone in the house we'd shared, I sat holding the sealed envelope Robert had left for me. Whatever was inside, it represented his final attempt to communicate something he'd been unable to say while he was alive. I traced my name on the envelope with my finger, feeling the weight of whatever revelation lay within. But I wasn't ready to open it yet. I needed time to grieve for the man I'd lost before I learned whatever truth he'd been so desperate to share. The envelope could wait another day or two. Robert's secrets had waited over 70 years. They could wait a little longer while I said goodbye to the love of my life. I opened Robert's letter 5 days after the funeral. on a quiet Sunday morning when the weight of his absence had become almost unbearable. I'd been putting it off, somehow knowing that whatever was inside would change everything I thought I understood about our marriage, our love, and my own past. The envelope was heavier than I'd expected, containing several pages of Robert's careful handwriting. My hands trembled as I unfolded the first page and began to read. My dearest Mildred, if you are reading this, then I am gone. If you are finally free to know the truth, I was too much of a coward to tell you while I lived. I pray that you can find it in your heart to forgive an old man's deception, though I understand if you cannot. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes, but I forced myself to continue reading. My name is not Robert William Benson. It never was. I was born Robert Harrison Caldwell in Topeka, Kansas. In 1921, I died officially at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, though my body survived what my spirit could not. The man you married was someone I created from the ashes of that day, someone I hoped might be worthy of the love you offered so freely. I had to stop reading and catch my breath, even though I'd begun to suspect something like this after receiving the military records. Seeing it confirmed in Robert's own words made it devastatingly real. I know this must be shocking, but please keep reading. There is more you need to know more. That explains why I could never tell you this while I lived. The truth is not just about who I was, but about who you were to me and who you have always been. My heart began to race as I turned to the second page. In December 1941, I was a young sailor assigned to the USS Arizona when the attack came. I tried to do my duty, tried to save my shipmates. I failed. They died, and I lived, and the guilt of that has haunted me every day since. I was pulled from the harbor, more dead than alive, burned and broken, and taken to a naval hospital where I lay unconscious for days. When I finally woke up, I was in hell. The physical pain was nothing compared to the knowledge that everyone I'd served with was dead. But there was an angel in that hell, a young nurse who treated me with such gentleness, such compassion, that I began to believe I might be worth saving after all. I knew what was coming before I read the next line, but seeing it written in Robert's familiar handwriting still took my breath away. Her name was Mildred Benson. She was 22 years old, with kind eyes and gentle hands that could ease pain with just a touch. She called me by a name I'd never heard before, John Doe, because I was too traumatized to tell her who I really was. But she treated me as if I were her most important patient, as if my recovery mattered more than anything else in the world. You saved my life, Mildred, not just physically, but spiritually. You showed me that there was still goodness in the world, still people who could love someone broken and lost. You told me that surviving wasn't failing, that sometimes living takes more courage than dying. I didn't believe you then, but I never forgot your words. The letter fell from my hands as the full magnitude of what he was telling me hit home. Robert hadn't just recognized me when we met at the library. He'd been looking for me. Our entire courtship, our marriage, our love story had been built on a foundation I'd never known existed. I picked up the letter with shaking hands and continued reading. I disappeared from the hospital because I couldn't face returning to a life where everyone I'd loved was dead. I thought it would be easier for everyone if Robert Harrison Caldwell simply stayed dead. I obtained new identity, papers it was easier to do in those days, and became Robert William Benson. I built a new life, but I never forgot the nurse who'd shown me kindness when I needed it most. For over 50 years, I looked for you. I searched military records, nursing registries, anything that might lead me to Mildred Benson. I had some leads over the years, but they always led to dead ends. I began to think you'd married and changed your name, or moved far away, or God forbid that something had happened to you. And then, in 1995, I saw you in the library. We're older, of course, as was I, but I knew you immediately. It's the same kind eyes, the same gentle way of moving through the world. You were reading about the war, and I wondered if you remembered me, if you ever thought about the patients you'd cared for all those years ago. I wanted to tell you who I was, but I was terrified. What if you didn't remember me? What if you were horrified to learn that you'd married someone who'd been living under a false identity for decades? What if our love which felt so pure and honest, was built on my deception. So I chose the coward's path. I let you fall in love with Robert Benson, not knowing he was really Robert Caldwell. I told myself that if you could love me without knowing our history, then maybe our love was real. Maybe I was finally worthy of the happiness you offered. The truth is, I was selfish. I wanted those years with you, even if they were built on a lie. You were the one bright spot in a life that had been defined by loss and guilt. You made me feel human again, made me believe that maybe I deserved a second chance at happiness. I know this revelation must be devastating. I know you must feel betrayed, deceived, used. I can only say that every moment of love I showed you was real. Every tender word, every gentle touch, every promise I made, all of it came from the deepest part of my heart. You were not a convenience or a solution to my loneliness. You were the answer to a prayer I'd been too afraid to pray. I was sobbing now, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Robert had carried alone for all these years. The letter continued, "There's one more thing you need to know. In my desk drawer, you'll find contact information for the National Archives. They have records of my service, records that will prove everything I've told you is true. I've arranged for them to be released to you after my death. I want you to have the complete truth, not just my version of it. I also want you to know that I've left you everything. Not because I feel guilty about deceiving you, but because you are my wife and I love you. The family will contest the will, of course. They'll say I was mentally incompetent or that you manipulated me. Let them. The lawyers have all the documentation they need to prove that every decision I made was of sound mind and free will. Please don't let their accusations poison what we had together. Our love was real, Mildred. It was the realest thing in my entire life. Twice me, twice once when you were 22 and caring for a broken sailor. And again when you were 62 and agreed to marry a lonely old man. Both times, you gave me hope when I had none. I hope someday you can forgive me for not having the courage to tell you this while I lived. I hope you can remember our 3 years together with love rather than anger. And I hope you know that. Wherever I am now, I am finally at peace, knowing that I was loved by the most extraordinary woman I ever knew." The letter was signed, "Forever yours, Robert Harrison Caldwell, who will always be grateful to have been loved by Mildred Benson." I sat in stunned silence for a long time after finishing the letter, trying to process the enormity of what I'd learned. Our love story hadn't begun 3 years ago, had begun over 80 years ago, in a hospital room where a young nurse had cared for a traumatized sailor. Robert had spent decades looking for me, and when he'd finally found me, he'd loved me so completely that he'd been willing to take his secret to the grave rather than risk losing me. The betrayal I might have felt was overwhelmed by a deeper emotion, profound sadness for all the years we'd lost, all the truth we could have shared. If Robert had trusted me with his secret, but I understood why he'd been afraid. He'd been carrying so much guilt, so much shame. He couldn't believe anyone could love him if they knew the whole truth. But I did love him, all of him, including the frightened young sailor who'd been too traumatized to give his real name. I loved the man who'd spent 50 years looking for the nurse who'd shown him kindness. I loved the husband who'd cherished me so completely that he'd been willing to live with deception rather than risk losing me. Our love had been real, regardless of the circumstances that had created it. And now I had to decide what to do with the truth he'd finally given me after reading Robert's letter. I knew I had to find my wartime diary. If Robert's account was true and in my heart, I knew it was then somewhere in those pages was evidence of our first meeting, our original connection that had somehow led us back to each other more than 50 years later. The diary was in the same hope chest where I'd found my hospital badge, wrapped in tissue paper and tied with a faded blue ribbon. I'd written in it faithfully during my 6 months at the Naval Hospital, documenting not just my duties, but my emotional responses to the wounded men I cared for. Reading it now, with the knowledge of who John Doe really was, would be like watching our love story unfold for the first time. I made myself a cup of tea and settled into Robert's chair in his study, surrounded by his books and papers. It felt right to read this here, in the space where he'd spent so many hours working on his own secret documentation of the past. The early entries were what I'd expected clinical observations mixed with a young nurse's shock at the reality of war. But as I progressed through December 1941, a pattern began to emerge. One patient appeared in my entries far more frequently than the others, described with an increasing sense of personal investment that went beyond professional duty. December 10, 1941. Arrived at Pearl Harbor Naval Hospital today. The devastation is beyond anything I could have imagined. We have over 200 casualties, many with burns covering 60% or more of their bodies. One patient in particular breaks my heart, a young sailor they're calling John Doe, who was pulled from the harbor hours after the attack. He hasn't spoken since he arrived, just stares at the ceiling with the saddest eyes I've ever seen. December 12, 1941. John Doe is awake more often now, but he still won't tell us his name. Dr. Morrison thinks he might have sustained some kind of head injury that's affecting his memory, but I suspect it's something deeper. When I change his dressings, he watches me with such intensity as if he's trying to memorize my face. I find myself talking to him more than I should, telling him about my day, about the other patients, anything to break through that terrible silence. December 14th, 1941, a breakthrough with John Doe today. When I was cleaning his wounds, I started humming a song my mother used to sing to me when I was sick. Suddenly, he spoke just one word: beautiful. When I asked what was beautiful, he said, "Your voice. It reminds me of home." It was the first time he'd spoken in a week. As I read, I began to remember. Not everything, but fragments: the young sailor's intense gaze, the way he'd seemed to hang on my every word, the strange sense of connection I'd felt with this nameless patient. I'd attributed it at the time to the heightened emotions of wartime, the way crisis could make strangers feel bonded by shared experience. But now I could see it had been something deeper. December 18th, 1941. John Doe asked me my name today. When I told him it was Mildred, he smiled for the first time since he arrived. He said it was his grandmother's name, that it meant gentle strength. I've been thinking about that phrase all day. No one has ever described me that way before, but somehow it feels true. December 20th, 1941. I had to work a double shift today, and when I finally got to John Doe's room, it was almost midnight. He was awake, staring out the window at the harbor. "I should have saved them," he said suddenly. When I asked who, he said, "All of them. My friends, my crew. They're all dead, and I'm here talking to a beautiful nurse. It doesn't seem fair." I told him that survival wasn't a crime, that sometimes living takes more courage than dying. He looked at me as if I'd said something profound, but I was just speaking from my heart. Reading those words now, remembering the conversation, I felt tears streaming down my face. This was the moment Robert had referenced in his letter, the words he'd said he never forgot. I'd spoken them to comfort a traumatized young man, never knowing they would sustain him through decades of guilt and loneliness. December 22nd, 1941. John Doe is remembering more about the attack. He told me he was on the USS Arizona, that he was trying to fight fires when the ship exploded. He said he was thrown into the water and doesn't remember anything else until he woke up here. When he talks about his shipmates, he cries. I've never seen a man cry like that, not just tears, but deep, body-shaking sobs that seem to come from his soul. All I can do is hold his hand and tell him he's safe now. December 24th, 1941, Christmas Eve. I brought John Doe a small gift, just a book of poetry I thought he might like. He was so touched that he started crying again. He said no one had given him a Christmas present in years, that his parents had died and he had no family left. I wanted to tell him that everyone deserves kindness, especially at Christmas, but something in his expression stopped me. There was such loneliness there, such isolation. I had the strangest urge to take him home with me, to give him the family he'd lost. I had to stop reading for a moment. The intensity of feeling in my own words was startling. I'd clearly cared about this patient far more than was professionally appropriate. But I'd been young, and he'd been so lost, so broken. It was natural that I'd want to comfort him. December 26, 1941. John Doe is being transferred to a psychiatric facility on the mainland. Next week, Dr. Morrison says he needs specialized treatment for what they're calling war neurosis. I know it's for the best, but I'm going to miss him. In just 2 weeks, he's become the patient I look forward to seeing most. There's something special about him, something that makes me want to keep him safe from the world. December 28th, 1941. I went to say goodbye to John Doe this morning, but his bed was empty. A nurse said he'd walked out during the night, just disappeared without a word. Security is looking for him, but I have a feeling they won't find him. Wherever he is, I hope he finds peace. I hope he remembers that surviving isn't something to be ashamed of. I hope he knows that someone cared about him, that he mattered. And there it ended. It's the last entry about the patient who had haunted my thoughts for weeks afterward. I'd wondered about him for months, hoping he was safe, hoping he'd found some way to heal from his trauma. Eventually, other patients and other responsibilities had pushed him to the back of my mind. But I'd never completely forgotten him. Now I knew why. We'd formed a connection in that hospital room that had transcended the normal boundaries between nurse and patient. He'd been looking for someone to save him, and I'd been trying to heal not just his body, but his spirit. We'd been two young people thrust together by war, finding comfort in each other during the darkest of times. But there was more in the diary that I'd forgotten, entries from later in my stay that showed how deeply his disappearance had affected me. January 5th, 1942. Still no word about John Doe. I keep thinking about him, wondering if he's all right. Dr. Morrison says patients sometimes run away when the memories become too painful to bear, that it's not uncommon for trauma victims to simply disappear. But I can't shake the feeling that I failed him somehow, that I should have done more to help him heal. January 15th, 1942. I had a dream about John Doe last night. He was older, much older, but I knew it was him because of his eyes. In the dream, we were sitting together in a garden, and he was telling me that everything had turned out all right, that he'd found peace. When I woke up, I felt strangely comforted, as if he'd actually been trying to tell me something. I know it sounds silly, but I can't shake the feeling that our paths will cross again someday. I closed the diary, overwhelmed by the weight of what I'd discovered. The young nurse who'd written those words had been right to our paths had crossed again, though it had taken more than 50 years for it to happen. The dream I'd had about him finding peace had been prophetic in a way, because he had found peace in our marriage, in our love, in the knowledge that the nurse who'd shown him kindness in his darkest hour had grown up to become the woman who would love him completely in his final years. But there was something else, something that made the whole story even more extraordinary. I went back to my hope chest and found the hospital bracelet I'd kept all these years, the one I'd found on John Doe's bedside table after he disappeared. I'd saved it without really knowing why, some instinct telling me it was important, even though I couldn't explain how. The bracelet number was 120747, December 7th, 1947. Not the date of the attack, but the date of our anniversary. Robert and I had been married on April 14th, but we'd celebrated our first date on December 7th, the anniversary of Pearl Harbor. I'd thought it was a coincidence at the time, but now I realized it had been Robert's way of honoring the day we'd first met, even though I hadn't known it. He'd been telling me the truth all along, in small ways, in subtle gestures, in the careful attention he'd paid to dates and details that seemed random to me but were loaded with meaning for him. Our entire relationship had been his attempt to bridge the gap between past and present, to reconnect with the woman who'd saved his life without forcing her to relive the trauma of that time. I sat in his chair, holding the bracelet and thinking about the extraordinary love story I'd just uncovered. We hadn't just found each other twice. We'd saved each other twice. In 1941, I'd given him hope when he had none. In 1995, he'd given me love when I thought I was too old for romance. We'd been meant for each other from the very beginning, two souls connected by war and reunited by destiny. The next morning, I called the National Archives again, this time armed with specific information from Robert's letter. I needed to see the complete hospital records, not just the military service documents. If our connection was as profound as I believed, there would be evidence of it in the medical files. Mrs. Benson, the clerk, said when I explained what I was looking for, We do have additional medical records for Robert Harrison Caldwell, but they're quite extensive. Would you prefer if we mailed them to you, or would you like to pick them up in person? I'll come get them, I said immediately. I couldn't wait any longer to piece together the complete picture of what had happened between us all those years ago. The drive to the National Archives took 2 hours, but it felt like minutes. I was consumed with anticipation, with the need to understand the full scope of our connection. The clerk handed me a thick manila folder, much larger than the first packet I'd received. I found a quiet corner in the archive's research room and opened the folder. Inside were dozens of document submission forms, medical charts, treatment notes, and something I hadn't expected. Photographs. They were clinical photos, the kind hospitals took to document injuries and track healing progress. But seeing Robert's young face again, even battered and bandaged, took my breath away. But it was the nursing notes that made everything clear. Page after page of detailed observations written in different handwriting as various nurses cared for him during his recovery. And there, starting on December 10th, 1941, were entries in my own young hand. Patient alert but unresponsive to questions about identity. Shows signs of severe psychological trauma. Responds positively to gentle approach. Note: patient seems most comfortable with Nurse M. Benson. Recommend continuing assignment. Reading my own professional observations alongside my personal diary. Entries created a complete picture of those weeks. I'd been professional and careful in the official records. But even there, my special attention to this patient was evident. December 15th, 1941, progress note by M. Benson. Patient spoke today for first time since admission. Breakthrough occurred during routine wound care when I was humming while working. Patient commented on voice being beautiful and reminiscent of home. Recommend music therapy as potential treatment avenue. December 18th, 1941, progress note by M. Benson. Patient expressed interest in nurse's background, specifically about name and family. Shared that Mildred was his grandmother's name. First genuine smile observed. Patient seems to be forming therapeutic attachment that may aid in recovery. But it was an entry dated December 20th that made me gasp. December 20th, 1941. Progress note by M. Benson. Patient discussed feelings of survivor guilt in detail. Expressed belief that he should have saved his shipmates. This nurse explained that survival is not failure, that living sometimes requires more courage than dying. Patient appeared deeply affected by this perspective. Note: strongly recommend that this patient be assigned exclusively to this nurse. There appears to be unique therapeutic rapport. Dr. Morrison had written his own note below mine. Concur with Nurse Benson's assessment. Patient shows marked improvement. In her care, continue exclusive assignment until transfer. The exclusive assignment. That explained why I'd spent so much time with him. Why our bond had grown so strong. Dr. Morrison had recognized something special in our connection and had arranged for me to be his primary caregiver. It hadn't been chance or coincidence. It had been a deliberate medical decision based on the therapeutic value of our relationship. I found the admission record that had started it all. The form filled out when he'd first arrived at the hospital. Under patient name was written, John Doe, identity unknown. But in the margin, someone had penciled in, Arizona survivor pulled from harbor 1500 hours the 7th of December, 41. There was a witness statement from the sailor who'd pulled him from the water. Found patient floating unconscious near Battleship Row, approximately 8 hours after initial attack. Severe burns on hands and arms, possible smoke inhalation. Patient was clutching life preserver marked USS Arizona. No identification found on person. 8 hours in the water. The fact that he'd survived it all was miraculous. The fact that he'd survived with the presence of mind to grab a life preserver showed the kind of determination that would later help him rebuild his entire life under a new identity. But it was the psychological evaluation written after he disappeared that broke my heart. Patient Robert Harrison Caldwell identity confirmed posthumously through dental records. Demonstrated classic symptoms of severe survivor guilt and post-traumatic stress disorder. His attachment to Nurse M. Benson appeared to be the primary stabilizing factor in his recovery. Her disappearance from his life when he was transferred may have precipitated his decision to abandon treatment. Patient repeatedly expressed belief that he did not deserve to live when his shipmates had died. He spoke often of Nurse Benson, words about survival requiring courage, but seemed unable to internalize this concept. His disappearance appears to be continuation of self-punishing behavior pattern. Recommend if patient is located. Immediate return to care of Nurse M. Benson. If possible, their therapeutic relationship was unprecedented in this examiner's experience. I stared at that last line for a long time. Unprecedented. Even the doctors had recognized that what we'd shared was extraordinary, that our connection had therapeutic value beyond normal nurse-patient relationships. There was one more document that completed the pictorial letter written by Dr. Morrison to the hospital administration after Robert's disappearance. I must express my deep concern about the loss of patient John Doe, now identified as Robert Harrison Caldwell. This young man showed remarkable progress under the care of Nurse Mildred Benson, who demonstrated exceptional skill in treating trauma cases. Nurse Benson's approach to this patient was exemplary. She showed not only professional competence, but genuine compassion that appeared to reach this deeply traumatized young man when other approaches had failed. Their connection was the foundation of his recovery, and I believe his disappearance is directly related to the severing of that therapeutic relationship. I have recommended that Nurse Benson be commended for her exceptional care, and I would request that she be given preference for similar cases in the future. Her ability to connect with traumatized patients is a rare gift that should be recognized and utilized. I was crying now, overwhelmed by the recognition that our connection had been acknowledged and valued even then. The young nurse had done something extraordinary. She'd reached a broken young man and given him hope. But more than that, she'd created a bond so strong that it had sustained him through decades of loneliness and eventually led him back to her. But there was something else in the folder that I hadn't expected, a small envelope marked personal effects. Inside was a single item, a pressed white rose, brittle with age, but still recognizable. Attached to it was a note in Robert's handwriting, from Christmas 1941. The only gift that mattered. The rose from the book of poetry I'd given him on Christmas Eve. He'd kept it for over 80 years, pressed between pages, and carried with him as he built his new life. It was proof that I'd mattered to him, that our brief connection had meant as much to him as it had to me. I thought about the white roses he'd brought me during our courtship, the ones Frank had said he left at the Pearl Harbor Memorial. They hadn't been random choices, they'd been his way of honoring that first gift, that Christmas rose that had meant so much to a traumatized young sailor that he'd carried it with him for the rest of his life. Everything made sense now. The careful way he'd approached our relationship, the reverent way he'd treated me, the sense I'd always had that he was seeing me through the lens of some deeper knowledge. He'd been loving me not just as the woman I was in the present, but as the nurse who'd saved him in the past. I found one final document at the bottom of the folder form I'd never seen before. It was a commendation letter dated January 30th, 1942. Nurse Mildred Benson is hereby recognized for exceptional service in the care of wounded personnel following the attack on Pearl Harbor. Our dedication, compassion, and innovative therapeutic approaches resulted in significant improvement in patient outcomes, particularly in cases involving severe psychological trauma. Nurse Benson's work with critically injured sailors demonstrated not only professional excellence but personal courage in the face of devastating injuries and emotional trauma. Her ability to provide comfort and hope to patients who had lost everything exemplifies the highest ideals of the nursing profession. This commendation will be placed in Nurse Benson's permanent record, and copies will be forwarded to her nursing school and current employer. I'd never seen this commendation, had never known it existed. But Robert must have known about ITZ military, kept detailed records, and his research into my background would have uncovered it eventually. It was further proof that what we'd shared had been recognized and valued, that I'd truly made a difference in his recovery sitting there in the archives, surrounded by the documentation of our first meeting. I finally understood the full scope of what Robert had carried alone for so many years. He'd loved me twice, first as a grateful patient who'd found hope in the darkness, then as a man who'd spent 5 decades searching for the woman who'd saved his life. The magnitude of his secret was overwhelming. Every day of our marriage, he'd known something I didn't. Every kiss, every shared meal, every quiet evening together had been colored by his knowledge of our history. He'd lived with the constant fear that I might remember him, might realize who he really was, might reject him for the deception he'd built his life around. But he'd also lived with the joy of having found me again, of being able to love me openly for the first time since that Christmas Eve in 1941, when a young nurse had given a broken sailor the only gift that mattered, the belief that he was worth saving. I carefully placed all the documents back in the folder, along with the pressed rose that had somehow survived 8 decades. These weren't just historical records, they were the foundation of the greatest love story I'd ever known. Proof that some connections transcend time and circumstance, that some bonds are too strong to be broken by war, trauma, or even death. The young woman who'd cared for Robert in 1941 couldn't have imagined that her patient would spend the rest of his life loving her. The elderly woman who'd married him in 1998 couldn't have known she was reuniting with the most important patient of her nursing career. But somehow, against all odds, we'd found each other again. Now I understood why Robert had been so insistent that I not let his family convince me our love wasn't real. It had been real from the very beginning, connection forged in trauma, and tested by time, but ultimately triumphant in its endurance. We'd saved each other twice, loved each other across 8 decades, and proven that some things are truly meant to be. The truth was more beautiful and more profound than any fiction. We hadn't just fallen in love in our golden years. We'd completed a love story that had begun when we were young and been interrupted by war, trauma, and the desperate choices of a broken young man who'd believed he was unworthy of the love he'd been offered. But he had been worthy. He'd always been worthy. And now, finally, I could love him with the full knowledge of who he was and what we'd meant to each other from the very beginning. That evening, sat in my apartment with all the evidence spread before me: Robert's letter, my wartime diary, the hospital records, and the pressed white rose that had somehow survived 8 decades. The magnitude of what I'd discovered was almost too large to comprehend. Our love story hadn't been 3 years long, it had been 80 years in the making. I thought about all the small moments that now took on profound new meaning. The way Robert had looked at me that first day at the library, with recognition, rather than mere interest. The careful way he'd ask my name, as if confirming something he already knew. His comment about Mildred being a beautiful name that suited me because he'd been thinking about his grandmother, about a time when a young nurse's voice had reminded him of home. Our first date, when he'd seemed nervous, not because he was an elderly man rusty at romance, but because he was reuniting with someone who'd saved his life 60 years earlier. The way he'd always seemed to know exactly what I needed, exactly how to comfort me, exactly what would make me happy because he'd been studying me, loving me from a distance for over half a century. I remembered the night he'd proposed, how he'd cried when I said yes. I'd thought those were tears of joy from an old man who'd found unexpected love. Now I knew they were tears of a patient who'd finally been reunited with his angel, a broken soul who'd been searching for the woman who'd shown him that survival wasn't failure. The hospital bracelet I'd kept all these years took on new significance too. I'd found it on his bedside table the morning after he disappeared, and I'd saved it without really knowing why. Some part of me must have sensed that it was important, that it represented something precious that shouldn't be discarded. For 83 years, I'd carried a piece of him with me without knowing it. But the most profound realization was how perfectly we'd been matched, even as elderly people meeting for what I'd thought was the first time. The connection between us had been instant and deep, the kind of bond that usually takes years to develop. We'd moved from friendship to love with a naturalness that had seemed miraculous at our age. Now I understood why we'd been completing a relationship that had begun decades earlier, picking up threads that had been severed by war and trauma. Robert had spent 54 years looking for me, 54 years of wondering what had happened to the nurse who'd shown him kindness, who'd given him hope, who'd told him that survival required courage. He'd built a successful life as Robert William Benson, but he'd never stopped being the young sailor who'd fallen in love with his caregiver's gentle strength. I thought about the guilt he must have carried, not just for surviving Pearl Harbor, when his friends had died, but for deceiving me about his identity. Every day of our marriage, he'd known something I didn't. Every time I'd talked about my nursing days, he'd had to carefully monitor his responses to avoid revealing his connection. To that time, every anniversary, every special moment had been colored by his knowledge of our shared history. But there was something else. I was beginning to understand the extraordinary nature of what we'd accomplished together. We'd loved each other twice, in two different eras of our lives, under completely different circumstances. The young nurse and her patient had formed a connection that transcended the usual professional boundaries. The elderly widow and widower had found a love that transcended the usual limitations of age and circumstance. Both connections had been real, both had been profound, and both had been necessary. The young woman I'd been couldn't have handled the full weight of Robert's trauma and need. I'd been able to give him hope and comfort, but I couldn't have saved him from himself. That had to come later, after he'd lived a full life and learned to value his own survival. The elderly woman I'd become was ready for the deep, complex love that Robert offered. I had the patience and wisdom to appreciate what we'd found together, the life experience to understand that such connections were rare and precious. I could love him completely without needing to fix him or save him. He'd already done that work himself. Our reunion had been perfectly timed. If he'd found me earlier, I might have been married to my first husband, unavailable for the kind of relationship Robert needed. If he'd found me later, one of us might not have lived long enough to enjoy our years together. The timing had been exactly right for both of us to be ready for the love we'd been meant to share. I picked up the pressed white rose and held it carefully in my palm. This fragile flower was proof of something extraordinary that love could survive decades of separation, that some connections were too strong to be broken by time or circumstance. Robert had carried this rose through his entire adult life, a reminder of the Christmas when a young nurse had given him hope. And I'd carried something too. Though I hadn't known it at the time, I'd carried the memory of the patient who'd touched my heart, the young sailor whose pain had seemed to mirror my own need to heal and be healed. He'd been the patient I thought about when I wondered if I was making a difference. The face I remembered when I questioned whether nursing was truly my calling. Our love story was more than romantic, it was redemptive. We'd both been marked by Pearl Harbor, both changed by that terrible day when the world shifted and young people were forced to grow up too quickly. But instead of letting that trauma destroy us, we'd used it to find each other. Twice, the young nurse who'd cared for Robert in 1941 had been practicing for her role as the wife who'd love him in his final years. The young sailor who'd found hope in her care had been learning how to value the gift of life he'd been given. All the years in between his decades of searching, my years of marriage and widowhood, the separate lives we'd built had been preparation for the love we'd finally been able to share openly. I thought about Robert's final words to me. "You saved me twice." Now I understood what he meant. The first time, I'd saved his life. The second time, I'd saved his soul, giving him the love and acceptance he'd been searching for since 1941. But the truth was, he'd saved me twice too. In 1941, caring for him had taught me what nursing really meant, not just tending to physical wounds, but healing the whole person. In 1995, loving him had taught me what marriage really meant, not just companionship, but the deep connection between two souls who truly see and understand each other. We'd been meant for each other from the very beginning. The war that had brought us together had also torn us apart, but it couldn't destroy what we'd found in each other. We'd loved across 8 decades, through separation and secrecy, through trauma and healing, through youth and age. It was a love story that defied probability, transcended time, and proved that some things are truly written in the stars. We'd found each other twice in one lifetime, once when we were young and the world was at war, and once when we were old and the world was at peace. Both times the connection had been instant, profound, and life-changing. Now I had to decide what to do with this knowledge, how to honor the truth Robert had finally shared with me, and whether to reveal to his family the extraordinary man they'd never really known. The decision to confront Robert's family with the truth didn't come easily. For 3 days after discovering the full scope of our connection, I wrestled with whether to honor his desire for secrecy or to finally give him the recognition he denied himself for over 80 years. In the end, it was something Robert had written in his letter that decided me. I hope you know that wherever I am now, I am finally at peace. He was at peace, but his family wasn't. Their suspicions and accusations were poisoning his memory, turning his final years into something tawdry and shameful. They deserved to know who he really was, what he'd sacrificed, and why he'd chosen love over fear in his final act of marrying me. But first, I needed to make sure I had all the legal documentation in order. Robert's warning about his family contesting the will hadn't been paranoia David had already filed. Preliminary papers questioning Robert's mental competency at the time of our marriage. I needed proof that Robert William Benson and Robert Harrison Caldwell were the same person, and that every decision he'd made had been rational and deliberate. I spent the morning at the courthouse working with Robert's lawyer to compile the evidence. The name change documents from 1947 were crucial. They showed that Robert had legally assumed the Benson identity, that he hadn't been living under a false name, but under a legally recognized one. The medical records from Pearl Harbor established his original identity and the circumstances that had led to his presumed death. This is extraordinary, Robert's lawyer said as he reviewed the documents. Never seen anything like this. Your husband lived under a legal identity for over 70 years, but he was actually a decorated war hero who was listed as killed in action. Decorated? I asked, what do you mean? The lawyer pointed to a document I'd missed in my earlier review, a commendation for bravery that had been issued posthumously to Robert Harrison Caldwell. He was awarded the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism during the Pearl Harbor attack. According to this, he helped evacuate wounded sailors and fought fires on the USS Arizona until the ship's magazine exploded. The Navy considered him a hero. Robert had been a hero, and he'd never known it. The commendation had been issued after he'd been declared dead, so he'd never received it. For 80 years, he believed he was a coward who'd failed his shipmates, when in reality, he'd been honored for his bravery. I thought about all the times Robert had said he'd just done his job during the war, all the times he'd deflected praise or recognition. He'd been carrying guilt for actions that had actually been heroic, punishing himself for survival that had been earned through courage and sacrifice. There's more, the lawyer continued. The military records show that several sailors were rescued because of his actions. He didn't just survive, he saved lives before the explosion threw him into the harbor. The injustice of it overwhelmed me. Robert had spent his entire adult life believing he was unworthy of love, unworthy of happiness, unworthy of the life he'd been given. But he'd been a hero, a man who'd risked everything to save others. The family that had questioned his character didn't even know his real name, let alone his true nature. What I don't understand, the lawyer said, is why he never claimed his military benefits. As a Pearl Harbor survivor, he would have been entitled to disability compensation, medical care, and other benefits. Why would he give all that up? 'Cause he was traumatized. I said simply, he was a young man who'd watched his friends die, who'd been declared dead himself, who'd lost everything that connected him to his old life. He thought it would be easier to start over than to face the memories. But there was another reason too, one that was becoming clearer as I understood the full scope of his sacrifice. Robert had given up his identity, his benefits, his very existence as Robert Harrison Caldwell because he believed he didn't deserve them. The survivor's guilt had been so overwhelming that he'd chosen to punish himself by living as someone else, someone who had no claim to military honors or recognition. The lawyer helped me organize everything into a comprehensive file: the name, change documents, the military records, the hospital files, my own diary entries, and the legal papers proving that Robert's marriage to me had been completely legitimate. It was a thick folder that told the story of a man who'd been living in exile from his own heroism for over 70 years. This should be more than enough to defeat any legal challenge, the lawyer assured me. Your husband was clearly competent when he married you, and he had every right to leave you his estate. But more than that, this documentation proves that he was an honorable man who deserved better than the suspicions his family has subjected him to. That afternoon, I drove to the Pearl Harbor Memorial again, but this time I wasn't alone. I'd brought a photographer to document something that needed to be recorded: Robert's name on the memorial wall, proof that he'd been officially honored. Even though he'd never known it. Frank, the groundskeeper, met me there with a piece of information I hadn't expected. Mrs. Benson, I've been thinking about what you asked me the other day about Robert's visits here. There's something I didn't tell you then that might be important now. He led me to a small maintenance building behind the memorial, where he kept records of flowers and tributes left by visitors. In a filing cabinet, he had a folder labeled Regular Visitors that contained notes about people who came frequently to the memorial. Your husband came here every December 7th for 15 years, Frank said, pulling out a thick file. But he also came on other dates: April 14th, which I now know was your wedding anniversary, and December 28th, which I never understood until now. December 28th, the date I'd written in my diary about Robert's disappearance from the hospital. He'd been commemorating not just the attack, but the day he'd chosen to leave his old life behind. He'd been mourning both his fallen comrades and his own lost identity. He always left white roses, Frank continued, and he'd stand there for hours just reading the names. Sometimes he'd cry, but quietly, like he didn't want to disturb the other visitors. One time I saw him trace his own name with his finger, and I thought it was strange. Now I understand why. Frank's records showed that Robert had donated money to the memorial fund every year, always anonymously, always on December 7th. The donations had been substantial, totaling over $50,000 over the years. He'd been supporting the memorial to his own sacrifice while hiding his identity from the world. There's one more thing, Frank said. Last year, on what turned out to be his final visit, he left something different. Not just flowers, but a small wooden box. I found it after he'd gone, sitting by his name on the memorial. Inside was a military dog tag and a note. He handed me the box, which he'd kept in his office, unsure what to do with it. The dog tag read, Robert Harrison Caldwell, USN, and the note was in Robert's handwriting, for my friends who didn't make it home. You are not forgotten. I stood there holding the dog tag, overwhelmed by the weight of what Robert had carried alone for so many years. This small piece of metal represented everything he'd given up: his identity, his recognition, his right to be remembered as a hero. But in leaving it at the memorial, he'd finally found a way to honor both his fallen comrades and his own lost youth. The photograph of Robert's name on the memorial wall would be crucial evidence in confronting his family. But more than that, it would be proof that he'd been a man worthy of honor, worthy of love, worthy of the respect they'd never given him. Tomorrow, I would gather them together and tell them the truth about the man they'd never really known. I would give Robert the recognition he'd denied himself for 8 decades, and I would make sure his family understood that their suspicions had been not just wrong, but cruel. He had been a hero twice over: first in the harbor at Pearl Harbor, and then in choosing love over fear when he'd married me. Both acts had required courage, and both deserved to be honored rather than questioned. The truth would set us all free, but most importantly, it would finally allow Robert Harrison Caldwell to rest in peace, no longer hiding from a heroism he'd never believed he deserved.